All right, I just wanted to cover this quick piece of journalism coming out because I think it's relative to all the talks and rants and frustrations I've been sharing on this channel. If you're not too familiar with who I am a struggling tech worker that's been out of work for a while, and I've been working these really weird contracting gigs and just doing really odd work to get some income. But you know, things are rough in the job market, but I think things are rough for just the average American these days. And there's been a recent article out stating how a lot of Americans have been deciding to live in their RVs more than ever, not by choice, but because they've been priced out of the housing market. You know, they can't make their mortgage, they can't afford to pay rent or whatever, and they decide to just resort to living in their RV and just, you know, traveling. Well, not traveling in a dramatic or romantic sense, but traveling in a survival sense where, you know, they kind of just park in the side of a park or find a place where they could seek refuge and, you know, live in a trailer. And they have kids, they have families. You know, these aren't your typical people that you would think would be living in an RV, but regular American families. So let's get into it. The article starts off by just, you know, giving a lot of examples of who's living in these places. I'm not going to read every piece of text here, but I'm just go over the types of families. Like, for example, this is covering a 12-year-old Dante and his mom. They are living in an RV, and it just describes, you know, like how they manage, how they sleep, how they eat. For example, it paints a picture here. You know, the RV doesn't have any tables or chairs, so he sat on a makeshift bed covered by a SpongeBob blanket with a cutting board on his lap, chopping peaches, apples, kiwis. So, you know, they're kind of just giving you an idea of how it looks like for these families living in an RV. You know, it's crammed. There's not a lot of space, obviously, and it's very unfortunate. But I want to cover the actual numbers that they mention here because that's the most important. So, as housing costs rise beyond what many families can afford, more people are looking for shelter outside the traditional housing market. About 486,000 people live full-time in an RV. This is important, all right, which appears to be more than twice as many as 2021, all right? So let's just round it up. About 500,000 people are living full-time in an RV. And, you know, this is significant because the rise in the amount of people living in an RV has doubled or more than doubled since 2021, which was not that long ago, meaning the economy is taking a huge dip. Most of these people had regular homes in 2021, all right? You know, in 2021 felt like 2 weeks ago. So for that many people to decide to basically kind of become homeless, I think that's a recession indicator. Am I going crazy? It's just, there's just all these stories and reports about, you know, all these layoffs, credit scores going down, and then now they're reporting there's 500,000 people living in RVs, twice as much as there was in 2021. There's just stacks of just evidence and symptoms that I think, I feel like the label of a recession should have just been, like, we're overdue. Like, I don't know why the government is trying to avoid the label. It feels like a recession. All right. Anyways, above a third have children. The vast majority earn less than 70K a year. Okay. In 2023, most recent data available, it's estimated 342,000 people were living in an RV, boat, or van, an increase of 41% from 2019. That's insane. Yeah, so a slowdown in the labor market has made it increasingly difficult for many families to make ends meet. Well, yeah, no shit. All right. I think we get the gist of it. People are living in the RVs. They can't afford rent. Okay, yeah, exactly. So here it says, this girl, after 3 months of missing her $2,000 rent payment. By the way, 2,000 is like the lower end of rent in a big city. Most big cities, like if you live in a major city like LA or SF, San Francisco, 2,000 is the lower end. 2,000 is like, if you live in a small town, $2,000 a month in a big city like LA is equivalent to a $400 a month apartment in Arkansas. In Arkansas, that $200 a month meth house is $2,000 a month here in LA. If you don't believe me, go on any real estate rental app, filter by price, select a big city, and you shall see. You will be amazed. Anyways, yeah, so I guess a lot of people miss their payments, get kicked out, and they have to live in the car or their RV. And this is very, very sad. But anyways, I'm just gonna give my own commentary on this. I don't think most people realize how close they are to being in this situation. Because let's just say you work and you have a decent career, but in this job market and how companies are managing and choosing how to go about doing things in terms of maintaining profit and pleasing investors, there's only 4 or 5 steps that will lead you to living in an RV or on the street, especially if you don't have savings. If you work for a company and you make decent money, let's just say you make $100,000 a year, you have a nice apartment, you have some savings, but unfortunately, let's just say one day you get laid off. Okay, you're not homeless. You're gonna survive for, depending on how much savings you have, you're gonna survive for a while. But depending on how competitive your industry is, you're going to keep looking for a job. And as you look for a job, your savings will dwindle. And then when it gets to a certain point, you're going to consider getting a job at a grocery store or something. And then you're going to realize how competitive that is. And then you're going to realize you're going to get discriminated because you look overqualified because you were working a higher paying job. So now you're a flight risk for a lower paying job. So you can't get a job in your industry because there's layoffs or it's competitive. And then you try to demote yourself to working somewhere else where it's like low skill labor, but then you're seen as a flight risk. Because to be honest, you are a flight risk. You don't want to work there. You're probably gonna be job hunting while working that low skill job, and the moment you have an interview, you're gonna be like, I'm on the way out. So that's how things are gonna work. So while this whole balancing act is going on, you're spending your money to pay your bills, and then eventually it's possible that you run out of money, and then you can't make ends meet. So either you have family and then you move back in with them, but if you're not fortunate enough to have family, you better look into living in your car or being homeless, all because of one layoff, all because of the competitiveness in the job market. A lot of people think it's easy to pivot, or they have friends they could call and give them a job. That's cool if that's the case, but hey, I have a lot of connections on LinkedIn. I had a lot of references. Ain't no one handed me a job yet. All right. Maybe that's just my case, but I hear that a lot of people that have connections, they try to, the best they could do is give a good word for you, but unless they're in a high position, they can't give you a job. And that's just the realistic scenario. But yeah, I don't know. All these articles and pieces are coming out, and I've been feeling like we've been in a recession for about over a year already. Whether it's a recession or not, I mean, people are struggling, and I think, this sounds so gimmicky and so like it sounds very canned. Like I'm just taking what I'm about to say from a clickbait headline and just repeating it on this video. And it sounds, I hate myself for even saying this, but it sounds like the middle class is dying. It feels like there's just poor people and then there's the wealthy people. And I think even people who are making decent money, like 150 or 250, they're being slaved to death. Like, that's not a comfortable 250. Maybe in terms of the finances, yeah, but in terms of how to keep that job, there's a guy on YouTube that makes 250K, right? I'm not gonna say his name. He made a YouTube video and he looked like he was dying because he, like, people were like, dude, get some sleep. I don't know. He looked like a zombie. But anyways, yeah, it's like whack-a-mole. You know the game whack-a-mole, where you cover two things and then another issue comes up, like the little groundhog comes up. That's how life feels like right now. It's like when you're unemployed, you have time and you have energy, but you have no money. And then when you have a job, you have money, but you don't have time and you don't have energy. So you keep knocking things down and you try like finding a perfect balance, but then there's always one thing missing. There's always one thing you have to sacrifice. Either you have to sacrifice your time to live, to make money, or you have to sacrifice your job to kind of live, but then eventually you run out of money. And that's the system that was set up for us. That's what we were taught to get into. But yeah, I'll just leave it there. This is an open-ended video. Let me know what you think in the comments. I just felt like shining a light on this article. This is a really good piece, by the way. I didn't want to read the whole article and just bore you guys, but I'll link this in the comments so you guys can read about it. But it's really insightful. All right, thanks for watching. Subscribe for more content, and I will see you in the next video.